period, which again, never a better time to do a startup than right now. I hope we can. We were like hiding out in this little building in Cambridge. PG was making us dinner. And, you know, what took 3 months to build at the time that each company built over the whole YC startup could now be done with in 7 minutes by a coding agent. And it was only 20 years ago. And I think the difference in what's possible for a startup now, what a startup can take on, you know, I think you could either be sad and be like, oh man, like a Codex prompt is a whole startup, or you could be like, I can go start the world's most ambitious, crazy company. I can have like experts in every field working together. I can do these very hard technological things that were just impossible. And it's going to be amazing. But at the time, it felt nothing like that. I think like ambitious startups are always awesome, and hard tech startups are appealing to a lot of people, but they're hard, or they've been hard. They still will be hard. But what you can do now to go take on a really ambitious project, like in the same way that you can make the startup that took us 3 months of nonstop work in 17 seconds, with 3 months of work and a lot of agents, you can do unbelievable things. So I think we will see a golden age of startups where people are like, you know what, I'm going to do things that would have been completely impossible for a startup to even like dream at a year ago in sort of like the YC timeframe.
I mean, that's actually a really big reframe. I mean, there are probably people even in this room who might be worried that, well, intelligence on tap means that, you know, they might be looking at a Looped or my startup Posterous, and they're like, well, I can't start that company anymore. But guys, that was like a long time ago, actually.
Man, there's this whole meme going around, which is like, you know, you have to join a frontier lab or you're going to be a member of the permanent underclass, because it's so dumb. Because there's going to be like, you know, startups are over and there's like no economic value. That's not true. I mean, if that were true, the world is like totally fucked and it's a very bad place. But I would bet that the average startups created today will be, like, I bet there's some future trillionaire sitting in this room. And I would bet that the startups created today will be much more valuable, much more impactful than startups of the past.
You know, how would you answer that, especially people who want to do these harder tech things?
Well, as a general observation first, I think startups tend to win when the sort of like technology landscape is moving very quickly, when costs are coming down, when cycle times are short, and all of those things are happening right now. So if you look at when there have been like the great clusters of startups in the past, you know, there was the internet boom in whatever that was, like 98, 99, when new things became possible. There was another version of, a mini version of people building on top of basically like Facebook apps. There was then another big version when the iPhone App Store launched. But the great startups tend to cluster when the ecosystem shifts and incumbents lose a lot of their advantage. And then also when you have these like cost and cycle time change. This moment feels very big for those things. It also has this other thing that you were talking about, which is a lot of the traditional things that were hard to get, expertise, you know, the ability to go like hire excellent people that could do specific things you needed, that's really shifted. And in the last few months, I have seen a lot of people who just kind of grew up using AI the last few years, who are like, I can kind of automate an entire startup of agents and 4 of us, 4 people, and you know, all this compute. And I think we're going to see much more of that. Clearly, like taste and agency and understanding of kind of like the physics of business, like where you can build up a valuable business, how to think what about like a good network effect or sort of a good moat looks like versus a fake one. They're wrong and irresponsible and bad. And maybe like my highest order, or like my highest bit of advice to all of you, is find the things that you can develop like reasonable conviction in, that people decide like the conventional wisdom is they're just wrong, and be okay with it taking a long time and having people be like very very frustratingly wrong and dismissive. For years at OpenAI, it felt like we knew the biggest secret in the world. Everybody was calling us an idiot. And we had increasing data points to convince ourselves we weren't delusional. And it was very frustrating. It was extremely frustrating. But looking back, it was like an incredible gift because it meant we didn't have this like massive competitors and we had time to do our research and build our stuff and build our company. But it's sort of like, those are much less frequently the big outcomes. So if I were you all, I would figure out what the really big brand new thing is that is possible now that wasn't possible a few years ago. In our case, it was no AI had really been working, and then the deep learning magic moment happened and the world didn't update enough. This is another great PG-ism. The world does not understand how to intuit exponentials. Yeah, we used to joke that only 50 people in the world believed that AGI was possible, but it was okay because 45 of them worked at OpenAI. And I think that's kind of true. Like, you don't need a ton of people. And in fact, saying the heretical thing was probably why those people wanted to like all be together. So again, I think like really figuring out what you believe.
I think Peter Thiel does this really, really well. What would you say to a room full of people who are just starting out and like figuring out who their people are?
Just like, highest confidence piece of advice here is just like find a way to be like mildly helpful to a lot of people. It's like fun to do. You'll see a lot of interesting stuff. It's like kind of gratifying to be helpful. But even that example you were just talking about, I met Greg Brockman, my co-founder of OpenAI, because I was a very early investor in Stripe when I was like 22 or something. And they were like, this was before they had, like real investors that could really help them. And they said, we're trying to close our first hire. Will you like drive down to Palo Alto tonight and have dinner with this guy to convince him he should like drop out of school and join Stripe, which is Greg Brockman. And then like 8 years later, we started a company together. So, and I could like, you could too. We could like spend the rest of this time just telling stories like that was totally unpredicted, but ended up being important in big ways. So I have, it's fun to do, and I think you should do it for its own reason, or it's like its own sake.
In the past, I've been known to be skeptical about safety in AI, but on the other hand, like this is a real moment. Like we're entering a new moment in what's happening with these frontier models.
Yeah, this is the real deal. And I think anybody who's not taking it seriously and at least a little bit scared or humbled, or a lot of those things, but at least a little bit, is not taking this seriously enough. So I think it's an alignment failure. I think it's a security failure. I think it's like a very serious thing, even though it's not the biggest example of consequence. And I think it's a real reminder of the stakes of what's happening, and that loss of control, accidents are not entirely theoretical things. And I can totally imagine worlds where AI leads to the greatest distribution of power we've ever seen. And I can also imagine worlds where AI concentrates power to a degree we have never seen. And one company or person or model having more power than everybody or everything else on Earth put together, whatever the sci-fi stories have said, I think that's terrible. And I think startups, because of the things we talked about earlier, will be naturally very well suited to make sure that this is widely distributed. But we want to enable as many startups, as many companies, as many people as possible. And that means that we have to, be fairly quite reserved about not imposing our worldview about what we think people should or shouldn't do with AI, or even what we think the good ideas are, while still making sure that we can ensure enough of a safety bar that stuff like the Hugging Face incident is not happening.
What would you say to him right
now? It's all going to work out. Like it feels like it is a crazy and this very stressful thing to do a startup. And, my first startup didn't work out great, and it was like a sort of difficult time in my life. But one of the things, I think many people say this as they look back on the early part of their career, you can make a lot of mistakes. You can fail at stuff. Like the tech industry in particular is very forgiving of this. And I would have just like, I wish I could have like told myself to like have all the drive and the ambition, but just like be a little happier along the way and trust that like eventually it was going to be okay, because it feels so difficult and scary and painful in the moment.